Well, thank you, Pauline, and this might take a little moment to adjust to sound, direction of notes, direction of recording. So just kind of hopefully this will all settle down in a minute or two, but do wave if you start not being able to hear me. Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to be here, to be part of this week and to speak. And when Lawrence invited me to speak, he suggested that I focus a little bit on a theology of prayer and the monastic, the contemplative theology of prayer. And so I've been given the opportunity of 3 talks, and so this will be spaced over the week. And this first talk is called Stumbling into Grace Towards a Contemporary Theology of Prayer. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims in Europe have walked the many ways of St. James, the Camino de Santiago. They've journeyed from as far away as Canterbury, Paris, Geneva, Granada, even St. Petersburg, to the northwestern Spanish city of Santiago de Compostela, where the bones of the Apostle James, the brother of the Lord, are allegedly housed. Participation in this pilgrimage has waxed and waned over the centuries. Its revival in recent times seems an astonishing, if difficult to interpret, sign of a new search for meaning or connection, a deep movement in and of the human spirit. Just a little background, it was among the most popular of the medieval pilgrimages and substantially encouraged and funded by the Benedictines at Cluny. And in its heyday, the Camino de Santiago is estimated to have attracted up to 500,000 pilgrims annually. It declined during the 15th and 16th centuries, with Martin Luther's remark about the Santiago shrine, "No one knows whether what lies in the apostle's tomb is a dead dog or a dead horse," indicative of a growing skepticism about relics and the saving efficacy of pilgrimage, and not just among Protestants. And it must be said that the cause at this time wasn't helped by the Spanish Inquisition, instituted in 1478, which persecuted foreign pilgrims for their alleged lapses in religious observance. It's a little off-putting. Well, during the 17th and 18th centuries, appetite for pilgrimage declined further under the influence of the new secular philosophies of the Enlightenment. And in 1867, only 40 pilgrims attended the feast day of St. James in Santiago. A century later, in the 1960s and 70s, things were not much different, with only 70 to 80 pilgrims arriving in Santiago each year. But in the 50 or so years since then, the figure has grown to over 200,000 pilgrims per year. Australian author Dee Nolan has written, "There was no celestial brightness to herald the extraordinary late 20th century rebirth of the Camino. No angels came bearing messages, but it would seem to be nothing short of a miracle that in our modern times, people from all parts of the world and of every religious persuasion, or sometimes none, increasingly feel the need to retrace the steps of the medieval pilgrim." Well, almost 2 years ago now, I joined the growing throng and walked the most frequented of the routes to Santiago, the Camino Frances, beginning in the French Pyrenees at Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and arriving after 800 kilometres and 34 footsore days at Santiago de Compostela, only to continue on for 3 more days to Finisterre, the end of the earth. It was a profound experience, challenging, humbling, quotidian, and like all contemplative experience, still changing me. I know not how. We are here in Rome, another famous pilgrim destination, to explore the question, to put it at its broadest, of spiritual renewal in our world. We are focusing on the role of the monastic tradition in encouraging renewal both within the church and beyond. And we're reflecting in particular on how the gifts of contemplation might be recovered, deepened, and communicated so as to engage with the needs of the modern world through a contemporary theology and practice of prayer. And it seems to me that perhaps fresh insight into these themes might be realised by bringing them into conversation with the spiritual hunger, confusion, and renewal reflected in the surprising revival of pilgrimage in our day. So this next section is called Spiritual and/or Religious. Most of the pilgrims I met were not, as they expressed it, religious, but many were happy to describe themselves as spiritual. They would have resonated with Father Lawrence's aphorism, "We are not human beings on a spiritual journey, but spiritual beings on a human journey." They did not apparently feel the need for confessional faith or corporate belonging to support them on this journey. In fact, most would have understood such confession and belonging, particularly as embodied in the institution of the church, as more likely to block than encourage an authentically spiritual life. Now, the question of what's at stake in this distinction between the religious and the spiritual is actually quite complex. Rowan Williams has suggested that, as it's commonly drawn, it involves an interlocking set of values and concerns. For those who identify as spiritual, not religious, religion tends to be associated with self-interested institutions, rigid dogma, hierarchy, and corporate discipline. To commit to one religion seems to imply rejection or hostility towards the claims and commitments of other traditions. On this view, religion is seen as exclusive, potentially intolerant, at worst murderous. Personally, it can feel coercive, restricting, and committing me, in the words of Williams, to practices that mean little to me, subjecting myself to codes of conduct that don't connect at all convincingly with my sense of who I am or what is creative and life-giving for me. And by contrast, the spiritual pole of this distinction seems intrinsically more flexible and open-hearted. It opens up and resources personal integrity at a new depth and puts human lives in touch with the sacred dimension of reality without sacrificing personal liberty and authenticity, or locking its practitioners into a tribal mentality, hostile to other sorts of meaning and commitment. And again, on this kind of an account, spirituality is seen to be non-sectarian, inclusive, its authority grounded in lived experience rather than atrophied tradition. And on this kind of an account, no wonder it seems more attractive. Well, Father John Main, whose name is going to be invoked a lot, I suspect, over this week, drew what at first glance looks like the same kind of distinction between the spiritual and the religious. He wrote of the searching hunger of many in the younger generation for authentic personal knowledge of the truth, and explained their rejection of the Christian religious structures of the West on the grounds that, quote, "we in the West have become too religious rather than truly spiritual." Well, in fact, I think John Main's distinction between the spiritual and the religious is subtly different from the one I outlined above, the contemporary distinction. And this difference is important as we seek to articulate a contemporary theology and practice of prayer. For John Main, as for all true teachers of prayer, the point of religious faith is not mere conformity to a belief system, doctrine, or pattern of conduct. It's about the transformation of human life. He knew that communicating access to transformation is necessarily interdependent with lived experience of transformation. And in this context, his criticism of religion and religiosity reflected his experience of a church that purported to speak of transformation while all too often failing to live it. His distinction between the spiritual and the religious, then, is to do with concern for what we might call the livingness of faith. The Spirit vivifying what is otherwise just a dead letter, a religious husk from which the vital kernel has been lost. So in a letter from the new monastic community he founded with Father Lawrence in Montreal, he wrote, "We cannot rest content with past forms and formulas. We must be on the pilgrimage to find new ways of speaking old truths to contemporary men and women at the profoundest levels." And in another reflection on the church, he described it as like a city without electricity, lighting its streets with candles while a great power source lay untapped in its midst. I love that image. And he insisted that the church can only proclaim what it is in the process of experiencing. The church can only proclaim what it is. But this appeal to the necessity of a living encounter with the realities proclaimed and the transformation promised by religious faith was in no way for him essentially incompatible with theological commitment, disciplined practice, and corporate belonging. Yes, the truths of religious faith can be verified and communicated only out of lived experience. Yet he would have maintained, I think, that without our being answerable to a reality that transcends us and our contemporary preferences and conceptions of life, then neither is authentic spiritual realization and growth possible. Because the problem, of course, is the way contemporary so-called spirituality can become self-enclosed and even narcissistic, annexed to projects of the self. When disconnected from its roots in a larger story, community, and accountability, and spirituality and spiritual practice can be reduced, and often unintentionally, to a lifestyle resource, wealth we can live by to paraphrase the title of a recent book, which is actually called Spiritual Capital, Wealth We Can Live By. And although it's by no means necessarily a bad thing that someone might pursue a personal experience of deeper peace or connectedness or centeredness, there remains a question how deep this kind of spirituality can actually take us. How critically can it engage our pre-existing desires, self-understanding and identity? As Williams has pointed out, post-religious spirituality tends to begin with the assumption that we choose what we're going to do and what kind of life we want. The spiritual dimension of life might be sought as a kind of supplement to augment our experience or ameliorate our suffering. Meditation as a practice for relaxation or performance enhancement, for example. But the sense that we might be answerable with our lives to... There'll be 10 of these. The sense that we might be answerable with our lives to a reality we did not originate and a call whose ramifications we cannot see, well, that's another thing altogether. So here then is the context for our seeking a renewed theology and practice of prayer. On the one hand, we must take seriously what I think of as a holy impatience of our contemporaries with authoritarian, formulaic, self-righteous, self-sufficing religiosity and religious systems. And on the other hand, we must seek to open the possibility of that encounter with transcendent reality which saves the spiritual from being just another lifestyle option, a consumer preference in a marketplace of self-chosen identity and value. And the concept of transformation allows us, I think, to engage both these aspects of our situation. So I want now to say a bit about that. What is it that we contemplatives are called to offer our world? Well, I claimed earlier that the invitation and gift of an authentic spiritual tradition is the transformation of human life. The problem is this word transformation is overused and can feel pretty slippery. So what exactly are we talking about? Well, one way or another, all the great spiritual traditions testify to the possibility of experiencing a profound shift in our human subjectivity, our personhood. And this involves a movement from being unconsciously identified with our individual, separate, alienated selves and enslaved by what Richard Raw calls our programs for happiness. A shift from that way of being to awakening, receiving, or realizing ourselves in such a way that we enter into a fundamentally different relationship with reality. Instead of being completely driven and obsessed by our egoic needs for security and approval, often fearful and threatened, we become open to a larger dimension and conscious of a deeper belonging. For someone on the journey of transformation, It's not that all suffering, frustration, and disappointment goes away. Far from it, often. But our perception and experience of these things alters. New possibilities for being emerge, even though our circumstances may not appear dramatically to change. And this process of the transformation of our subjectivity can take the form of what can look like a sudden breakthrough or realisation. But mostly and most often it occurs in stages over time, which is why the spiritual life is often described in the metaphor of a journey or a pilgrimage. And the first part of the journey is always to do with coming home to ourselves, finding or knowing ourselves more fully. Because although our small, separate self is called ultimately to be fully yielded, let go, transcended, we seem first to need to be reintegrated, restored to ourselves and to community. This involves the experience of deepening wholeness, the healing of wounds, a release from unhelpful scripts and patterns of behaviour. It's a process that demands practices like acceptance, forgiveness, compassion, and truth-telling, the acknowledgement of hurts and dividedness. There are many examples of this dimension of the process of transformation in the Gospels. I think of the Samaritan woman at the well, shunned by her community and seemingly adrift in her own life, empowered to relate differently to her history and her neighbours after she's seen and accepted by Jesus. I think of Zacchaeus, converted from his grasping after financial security. He's a greedy tax collector, you'll remember. He's met in his shame and so released to offer restitution and hospitality to others. And there's the Gerasene demoniac, liberated from tormenting self-alienation, restored to himself, and so to playing his part in the well-being of his community. A particularly powerful expression of the dynamics of this process of transformation, how it actually happens, is narrated in John's Gospel, in the final appearance of the risen Jesus to Peter. In this episode, the disciples are depicted as having returned to their old lives, fishing again in Galilee, as if their life with Jesus had never been. They share breakfast with him over a charcoal fire. Like the fire, and the word is anthrakia, over which Peter had denied Jesus 3 times in the high priest's courtyard. And after breakfast, recapitulating this threefold denial, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if he loves him. Rowan Williams notes that in this exchange, Jesus addresses Peter as Simon, son of John, the name he had when he was first called to discipleship. Simon has to recognise himself as betrayer. That is part of the past that makes him who he is. If he is to be called again, if he can again become a true apostle, the Peter that he is in the purpose of Jesus, rather than the Simon who runs back into the cosy obscurity of ordinary life, then his failure must be assimilated, lived through again, and brought to good and not destructive issue. And in this story, we see how the experience of being reintegrated, being restored to ourselves, is sometimes and necessarily painful. It's not that Peter's being led to own and acknowledge his betrayal is a precondition of being forgiven, in the sense that Jesus is requiring a bit of grovelling before he lets him off the hook. It's rather that unless Peter can be present to the full truth of himself and his past, then he cannot be given back to himself and called into renewed relationship. Without this acknowledgement and naming, a part of himself would have to be resisted or avoided, covered over, perhaps, by self-loathing. He needed, as one author wrote, to make peace with his actualities. And that's not easy. And we will all have experiences of that process. Forgiveness is freely offered to Peter, but it costs him something to receive the gift. So the identities given back to those who encounter Jesus in the Gospels are transformed. You don't go back to being Peter in the same old way after that's happened. They're no longer enslaved in quite the same way by woundedness, fear, habitual responses, or even what others think of you. They are no longer uncritically enmeshed in what Thomas Keating called the false self system. And yet, even though these identities are enlarged and healed, they remain still separate, still egoic. A bigger, but still egoic. And the New Testament, together with the spiritual wisdom of other traditions, proclaims the possibility of a further transformation of subjectivity. And this involves not only the healing and partial liberation of the self, but the transcendence of finite, separate selfhood altogether through transforming union with God. This is what Jesus prays for on behalf of his disciples as he prepares for his death. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one. And St. Paul writes of his experience of having been divested of his separate self, crucified with Christ, such that it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And St. Peter, who we have to mention in Rome, understands that through Jesus we are given the possibility of becoming sharers in the very being of God, or participants of the divine nature. And John Main returns time and again to this theme of radical self-transcendence through transforming union with God. He's concerned that most Christians lack a felt sense that this is indeed the promise and the trajectory of the authentic spiritual journey and of every human life. We're too unambitious, he thinks, too willing to settle for less than we are called to. So Main speaks of this journey into union in terms of the transcendence of self-preoccupation and self-consciousness. He writes of experiencing ourselves as grounded in God by falling into the depths of love with a complete letting go, knowing for ourselves the great fact of all existence, that our being is from being itself. being with a capital B. The human heart, he says, longs for union with ourselves, with others, with God. One side of us seeks to preserve our separateness, but our godlikeness is stronger than this egoism. It makes our hearts restless until we find the peace of union. In the depth of our being, he goes on, we are relentlessly summoned by a love that will not give up to realise our union with God, in whom we have our being. It's kind of heady stuff, hearty stuff, heady and hearty stuff, and not many perhaps realise this union in this lifetime. And it's important to recognise that the reality of union and our conscious realisation of it are distinct things. In one of his last talks, Thomas Merton said, "In prayer, we discover what we already have. You start where you are and you deepen what you already have, and you realise that you are already there. We already have everything, but we don't know it and we don't experience it. Everything has been given to us in Christ. All we need is to experience what we already possess." And he goes on to say that indeed at any moment you can break through to the underlying unity which is God's gift in Christ. So I find this comforting to think that in one sense we don't have to worry and there's nowhere else to get to. We're already here in God. And St. John of the Cross says that God is present in all souls, as in all created realities, in a natural union of God and the self. And yet, it does make a difference whether we are on the way to a more conscious realisation of this reality, on the way to what John of the Cross called the supernatural union of likeness that comes from love. And again, Rowan Williams, commenting on why this matters, says, "The question put to the believer is about the ultimate direction of his or her life. For the sake of what do we live? If the answer to that is in terms of self-directed concern or finite matters in general, then the human person is failing to respond to the deepest vocation of its being, which is this call to likeness, to be like God." And he says the central paradox is that human fulfillment lies in going beyond the confines of the self and the tangible world to share the freedom of God. So in other words, this state of union, which the great spiritual teachers speak about, is the full truth of our existence if only we would come to know it. And as John Main often said, the point is not to be radically self-conscious about, are we there yet? The point is simply to be on that way, directed towards that relation. And as we make this journey, in our deepening realisation of this joy and of this union, we increasingly make God known, because the life of God begins to show through our life. The character of the divine life becomes visible. And the gift of this to others is that as we offer ourselves up to this journey, to this transformation, the character of our love is profoundly changed. Cynthia Bourgeot writes, "The reason for undergoing this transformation is not personal self-realisation or even the personal experience of transforming union, but to be able to participate fully here and now in the generative, self-giving love of the Trinity. And she goes on to say that separate, fearful, anxious selves can't do that because we're curved in on ourselves, self-protecting. We are inherently unstable, anxiety-ridden, and prone to judgment, even violence, when we sense ourselves threatened. Only as we become free of this limited, stuck definition of ourself can we flow into one another and into life in true gospel fashion, loving our neighbours as ourselves. And again, this might sound abstract and way out of reach and a bit ethereal, but it does have concrete effects we can recognise. I think of the story of St. Francis embracing the leper, not as this sense of good and righteous Francis reaching out to the poor, but as that felt expression of union with all things. And I think too of Thomas Merton's famous account of his sudden realisation one day in a shopping district in Louisville on the corner of 4th and Walnut that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. And in just the same vein, St. John of the Cross understood that the state of union means that we see the world as God sees it. And this necessarily involves our conversion, our reconversion to creatures, to love of the world. And to quote Merton again, then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. So this is the gospel. This is the gospel we have to proclaim. News of the possibility of the radical transformation of our identities, the realisation of our communion with the source of all life, God's life-generating love. So, how do we give ourselves to it? I'll say more about this in later talk. But as I've already intimated, the Christian tradition understands this as a movement of self-dispossession and not just self-fulfillment. There's something to be let go, the egoic self and its fears and self-protection. And this is a paschal journey. We die into life. By his own journey through death and into resurrection life, Jesus has gone ahead to show us the way. He's created a path for us to follow and the confidence through faith to entrust ourselves to it. But all of us must make this journey for ourselves. And I want to highlight two elements in particular that distinguish this paschal journey from generic notions of spirituality or spiritual experience. First, this journey involves a dynamic of being answerable, being responsive to a call that we haven't invented, and which leads us always beyond our previous securities, beyond any illusion that we can master or control our progress. You did not choose me, Jesus tells his disciples, but I chose you. On this understanding, The spiritual journey is not about aiming to achieve a particularly holy persona or enjoying a certain lifestyle experience, but responding to a reality that transcends us, a reality that's prior to us and authoritative over us. And almost always responding to this call involves, as Peter learnt, a comprehensive and painfully self-displacing process. It leads us into the desert, the night, beyond our settled belonging and identity, into uncertainty and unknowing. William speaks of the decision to obey Christ as an acceptance of the hidden God and his strange work, the God who is attained only through stripping and the purgation of his consuming fire. And again, we mustn't spiritualize this. It's not about self-conscious holiness or anything particularly dramatic, but just the transformation that is wrought in us as we bring our ordinary lives, including our sufferings, disappointments, boredom, and disillusion, to God as the place where God will work in and through us. And so this also means that the spiritual journey demands the whole of us. We're always tempted to hold something back, to have some foothold in our old identity, some back door for the fearful and controlling ego which constantly seeks to have life on its own terms. But Jesus says simply, follow me. And he gives short shrift to those who want to hedge their bets or hang on to some piece of their life not yielded to the way. In the process of transformation, John Main says, no part of ourselves, no aspect of our total human sensitivity is lost or destroyed. And yet this is true only as we yield ourselves fully, receiving ourselves back as gift on the other side of what looks like, what promises annihilation. And we resist this total self-giving. What we try to do, he says, is to maintain observation points, base camps along every stage of our development. Each of these little camps is an outpost of the central HQ of the ego. But as that great spiritual teacher, Judi Dench, so wisely expresses it in The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, it's like being in the surf. As long as we resist the waves, trying to stay safe and in control on the edge, we remain separate from the greater life. It's only by diving in, going under, dying, that we come out alive on the other side. And religious life offers an embodying structure for these twin imperatives of answerability and total self-giving. We're answerable to God alone, but we must learn how to hear. Ideally, a religious community draws us into practices of deep listening and true obedience, teaching us to discern between the whims of the religious ego and the true voice of God. And in the company of fellow pilgrims, guided by a tradition, we discover how God has spoken to others in and through the scriptures. We enjoy communion with God and with others through the sacraments and common life. And at the same time, the very embodied nature and the material nature of religious life teaches us in ordinary and wholehearted ways to give ourselves to this journey of transformation. And monastic life makes all this vividly apparent. St. Benedict's rule lays down a way of life by which in every aspect of life, answerability or obedience to God may be practiced. My words are meant for you, whoever you are, Benedict writes in the prologue, who, laying aside your own will, take up the all-powerful and righteous arms of obedience to fight under the true King, the Lord Jesus Christ. And off he goes to detail patterns of praying and sleeping, eating, working, leadership, dispute resolution, and corporate life. And every feature of this life, the use of time, gestures of the body, patterns of silence and speech, solitude and community, is designed to make visible the reality of God's presence and to open the monks more fully to being transformed by that presence. Now, of course, we know that in religious life and religious institutions, all this can go very badly wrong. The embodying structure ends up becoming a complacent end in itself, stifling or shutting up the way of transformation rather than intensifying and enabling it. Jesus made similar criticisms of the religious establishments of his day. I'm going to say more about that in a later talk, but for now, the point I emphasise is that this journey of transformation into Christ-likeness, into radical union with self-dispossessing love, involves necessarily the whole of us. And this is where even the so-called non-religious pilgrim might be more attuned to the authentic spiritual journey than they're given credit for, and more religious than they themselves might recognise. It's not straightforward, of course. On the Camino, our feet got sore very quickly. One of our fellow pilgrims expressed her dismay at her preoccupation with her feet. "I thought it would be a more spiritual experience," she said. Well, on the account that I've just been giving, that was the spiritual experience. So there's confusion in what people are looking for. Nevertheless, pilgrims are responding to a call that comes, as it were, from beyond themselves. Yes, they've chosen to take a walk, but most of the people I spoke to felt compelled in some sense to put themselves on the way. It had become an imperative, a ripeness. Something in them, and why not call it the Spirit, knew they needed to be displaced, stripped of familiar surroundings and the trappings of an old identity, not quite knowing why or how the journey was going to change them. And they were there bodily, their whole selves vulnerable to what came, day after day of heat, rain, and glorious autumn light, mud, cobblestones, and miles of foot-pounding asphalt, hunger, thirst, tiredness, despair, and elation. And if their experience was like mine, the sheer physicality, dailiness, and single-mindedness of the pilgrimage, like monastic life, took them deep into solitude, into painful memories and unhealed hurts, and unpalatable knowledge of themselves. As I discovered, despite years of meditation and spiritual practice, if I'm cold, tired, and hungry, I'm just cranky. To be a pilgrim is to be humbled even at times humiliated. It brings us to poverty of spirit. More and more people in our world are being drawn one way or another to the Pilgrim Way. The institutional church in Spain seemed largely oblivious to the significance of this. Most parish churches were locked as we passed them. When I asked why, I was told it was because they didn't have the personnel to protect the treasures stored inside them. When we got to the cathedral at Santiago, we discovered that pilgrims, as well as not being allowed inside with our backpacks on, were no longer allowed to touch the statue of St. James. A rite of arrival for hundreds of years, the church is concerned that too many hands are wearing the statue away. So instead of maybe putting some renewable resin in the affected part and allowing this corporeal practice of thanksgiving to continue, the statue is now locked away out of view. You have to pay money even to be allowed to see it. So the church was, in many places, and to say the least, disappointing. Not exactly attuned to or enabling the journey. And I should say the pilgrims weren't all paragons of virtue either. But many are authentically, vulnerably on the way, yielding themselves to the journey of transformation, even if often lacking a theology, a community, and a practice of prayer that can support them in their deep intuition of its necessity and sustain them to continue the work begun in them when they return to daily life. And this is why I think our gathering is important for the church, for a hungry world. What practice of prayer and common life can lead all of us into and sustain us on the deep and challenging undergoing of radical transformation? How might this practice become part of the renewal of a church capable of meeting and nourishing the many people who are seeking God, seeking to be blessed so that they in turn might bless the world? This, for me, is the context of our gathering, and these are questions that I'll return to, and I'm sure others will in the talks to come. Thank you.